Hi everyone, Dr. Mike Slider here to give you a brief guide on how you calculate standard deviation. Standard deviation is probably one of the most important terms in statistics for you to understand. It's used in the calculation of essentially every inferential statistic. It can simply be defined as the average distance between a score and the mean. That is, how far are the scores from the center of that distribution. Calculating standard deviation involves 4 simple steps. You don't even need to know the formula. You just need to know the 4 steps. Step 1, find the deviation scores. Step 2, square the deviation scores. Step 3, find the mean of the squared deviation scores. And step 4, find the square root of the variance. So when we're calculating standard deviation, we start with a set of scores. We have a set of scores right here. 30, 29, 41, 35, 33, and 36. Okay, we have n equals 6 scores. The first step to calculating standard deviation is to calculate deviation scores. Deviation scores tells us how far each individual score is from the mean. So the first step to getting these deviation scores is to calculate the mean. The mean for this set of scores is 34. So we take 34 and we subtract it from each of these individual scores. So 30 minus 34 gives us negative 4, 29 minus 34 gives us negative 5, and so on. Now the goal of standard deviation is to get at the average amount of variability around the mean. Well, we can't just use these pure deviation scores because when we add these up, it gives us 0. So what we end up having to do is square each of these deviation scores. Okay, so these are our squared deviation scores. Negative 4 squared is 16, negative 5 squared is 25, 7 squared is 49, and so on. All of these scores are going to be positive. Now, we're trying to get the average of these squared deviations. So in order to get the average, the first thing that we do is add up these squared deviations, and that gives us a term called the sum of squares. The sum of squares is a term that comes up in statistics again and again and again, so it's important to be aware of where that term comes from. From here, in order to get the average, we would typically divide by the number of scores that we have. We would typically divide by n. Now, that would be the case if we were working with a population. However, here we're working with a sample. We only have 6 scores. Okay, and we know that a sample isn't a perfect representation of the population, and we acknowledge that by using what we call degrees of freedom. Okay, so degrees of freedom in our case would be n minus 1. n minus 1. So we take our sum of squares and divide it by n minus 1. So we end up with 96 divided by 5, and that gives us 19.2. 19.2 is the term that we call the variance. Okay, it's the average of the squared deviations. Now, in order to convert variance back down to sort of the original scale, we have to take the square root. Okay, we squared the numbers previously in this step. We're going to take the square root here to put it back to the original scale. So we have 19.2. We take the square root of that, and we have a resulting value of 4.38. So our final standard deviation of this set of scores is 4.38. So what this is telling us is that the average distance of a single score from the mean is 4.38. So that is how you calculate standard deviation in just a couple of minutes. And that wraps up this brief podcast. Have a great day, everybody.